All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, April 2nd. And what are the biggest news stories in the past 48 hours?
The biggest news stories. Well, today is Liberty Day. That President Trump has stated. He stated earlier that he was going to impose all kinds of tariffs on all kinds of countries across the world today. And I guess nobody but Trump, and maybe even Trump himself, really doesn't know what this is going to consist of. We're going to find out.
Do you feel like this is liberating in any sense of the word for the United States? We're using this term Liberty Day.
Yeah. No. I think, I'm not dogmatically opposed to all tariffs. Actually, most economists are. According to standard economic theory, tariffs don't work. They damage the country that's imposing the tariffs every bit as much as the other countries. That's generally the case. And, I think that's probably true all in all. But I'm willing to say that there's some exceptions. There's sometimes when, you may want to protect an industry. I'll just give you an example, like rice growing in Japan, because it's so much an important part of the culture. Okay, the truth is that you could import cheaper rice elsewhere and you could free up that land. But, it's important to the Japanese to preserve those rice paddies. It's just part of who they are. Yeah, that's just one example. Not everything is an economic question. It's a mistake, I think, to make everything an economic question. Or it's important maybe there's an industry that's just very important to various rural communities across the U.S. And those goods can be produced much more cheaply elsewhere. But these communities are dependent on it, maybe, you can argue back and forth on these things. I understand the counter arguments too, which are pretty good, but again, I'm just not dogmatically opposed to tariffs. I think there are some instances where you can make a good argument for them, where you can justify them. The problem with Trump's approach is just that it seems to be, first of all, kind of haphazard and inconsistent. And it's really important, I think, to be consistent, to demonstrate that you've thought it through and that you're going to stick to it. Because this is something that investors depend on this. They have to, if they understand there's going to be, for example, a 25% tariff on something, and it's going to be there for at least 20 years, they'll make investments accordingly. And they'll invest back in the communities that you want them to invest in. But if you slap on a tariff and then you rescind it, the next week, and then you slap it on again, and then you double it, and then you have it or whatever. And, that's what we've seen with Trump. It doesn't seem like he's really thinking these things through. He has an instinct that tariffs are good, and he just kind of shoots from the hip. That uncertainty is really the enemy of investment. Investors need a certainty. They're going to devote a huge amount of money, and they have to have some reasonable expectation that they're going to make a good return on. It's not, they don't want to just make it a roll of the dice. Well, who knows, maybe he'll double the tariffs, a year from now we'll be even better off or something in this industry. We'll be even more protected. Because he just might cancel it altogether. And then the next, if the tariff wasn't really thought through and there was no effort to get bipartisan support, well, the next president may very well be a Democrat who will, cancel them, or a Republican that is, pro-free trade. So, by being inconsistent, by being so, kind of impulsive in the way that he slaps on these tariffs, I think he's even defeating the purpose of the tariffs, which is to increase investment in certain industries. So I think it's actually, it is going to have a detrimental effect. Who knows how much it will be. It may end up tipping the economy into a recession. I know that some, economic forecasting groups are saying that it's increased the chance of recession by, 20% or whatever. And who knows, these actually, it's very difficult to forecast the economy. But there is obviously an increased risk of a recession after these tariffs are imposed. And there definitely will be price increases. That can't be avoided.
When you're talking about a recession, are you talking about a recession just here in America, or are we talking about a global recession? Because I've been hearing talks about that.
Yeah. Well, I would say both. I'm thinking in particular about the U.S. economy, but there is a risk all around. Now, interestingly, you think about it, there are certain countries that won't be affected by this at all, or maybe just positively affected, and Russia is one of them, because Russia doesn't export anything to the U.S. Sometimes you hear Trump threaten tariffs against Russia, but there's really nothing that he can slap a tariff on, I think, other than uranium. That's about it. I think uranium and fertilizer, there's very, very little trade going on between the U.S. and Russia. So what he's done actually in the case of Russia, and he has made threats recently, which is really quite disappointing. If you say that you're taking a whole new approach, he's going back to the old, U.S. hegemonic, we will punish you if you don't comply with our requests kind of approach. He says that, like, if he feels that the Russians are dragging their feet, if they're not carrying forward, if they're responsible for the failure to the negotiations to proceed, he will consider, at least, he may very well slap secondary tariffs on other countries. I think he became aware, or he knows that there's really nothing that he can, there aren't any direct tariffs really that are worthy of consideration between the U.S. and Russia. But by secondary tariffs, he means that any country that, for example, buys Russian oil would have a tariff slapped on them. So like if China, of course, buys a lot of Russian oil. Say, if you don't stop buying Russian oil, we're going to, impose a 25% tariff, an extra 25% tariff on everything. Or India buys a huge amount of Russian oil. But again, these are huge countries, and they just may very well balk at that. And if they actually comply, then the consequences for the world oil market is going to be huge. They're going to be huge. They're going to, because if you actually have some success in taking Russian oil off the market, the supply is greatly reduced, and then you're just going to see much higher prices at the gas pump, and that's not good either. So either way, it's no matter how you look at it, it's really a very harmful approach that Trump is taking. For tariffs, it's part of it is economic, but then he's also using tariffs as a way of punishing other countries. And it's really no different from what earlier administrations did, with the use of economic sanctions.
So do you believe that these tariffs will damage the U.S. the most? It will hurt the whole world, and the countries that will do the best would be countries like Russia, because they're already self-sufficient, and Iran. These two countries that have been heavily sanctioned are the two countries that were sort of waging a proxy war against. Those will do fine. The U.S. will get hurt the most, and the rest of the world will also suffer. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. if we just look at these sanctions that are supposed to come out and be rolled out today on Liberty Day.
All right, Liberty Day, let's go.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it really kind of hurts all the world except for Russia and Iran.
It boggles my mind how we can be taking such self-destructive steps. I understand the concept of wanting to boost manufacturing here in the United States. It's something that needs to be done. But like you said, think it out, and you can have smart people to think it out. Just to protect, infant industries, you pinpoint things that we need to grow. These are vital for our national interests. We need to, increase machine tool manufacturing in the United States. We'll target that. We'll protect those industries. Instead of, like you said, flippantly, we'll do 25% on these guys. Well, maybe not right now. And then we'll put on 50% later. BRICS, if you even think about doing something, we'll put 100% on you. And then just, like you said, it's just shooting wildly from the hip and then changing your mind.
Yeah.
I just don't understand how anybody could think this is a good approach. Yeah. If he's supposed to be a businessman.
Right. I've always noticed that he just doesn't really seem to have a firm grasp on numbers. And we've talked about that earlier. I think earlier he mentioned that, the Russians lost 60 million, 60 million dead in the Second World War. And that was way off. And he often does, he just seems to, his numbers are all over the place. And, maybe if you're, it was in certain topics when you're dealing with certain matters, that's not maybe quite so important. It's just like, it's a way of saying there are lots and lots of people died, and that's the point that he's trying to make. Okay. But when you're talking about tariffs and the percentages, the math really does matter. And you just have to be very disciplined and sit down, figure it out. And there's not one person that can do it. You got to have a team of experts, really think this through and then come to a very solidly based conclusion. And that's something that can withstand, if you impose certain tariffs, on certain countries with respect to certain industries, and you've done the research, well, that's something that's probably going to stay there. Like the next administration will say, yeah, okay, yeah, that made sense. And the investors understand that, and it could end up having the positive effect that you're hoping for. But, this is just a problem with Trump. I mean, it just is kind of his, he feels things. Sometimes it seems more than he thinks them through, yeah, he's always been kind of, his numbers have always been kind of creative, let's just say. And that's a serious, serious problem when you're using those numbers to restructure world trade. It's a cause for much concern.
Okay, so rocky economic times ahead. What does this mean for BRICS? Trump has talked about making sure that BRICS doesn't establish an alternative currency, but this type of move, I feel like, is just further strengthening the BRICS idea. It's like, well, we can't have this madman that's leading the world just changing rules willy-nilly, or I shouldn't say necessarily madman Trump, just saying a mad country, essentially. Okay. It's not just, but wouldn't this cause BRICS to sort of reestablish its necessity in the world?
Yeah, I would say so. In general, again, the U.S. has been a safe haven. It has been in so many ways, the anchor of the world economy. There have been growing economic problems over the decades, but it's just that the U.S. is a place where law reigns supreme, and it was actually quite boring in a way, meaning that it's just like policies didn't change dramatically. It's not a place it was subject to revolutions or erratic changes in policy. And that has made it an attractive haven for investment. And especially, it has bolstered the U.S. dollar and has sustained its role as the world's reserve currency. And these actions by Trump and previous actions, it's not like this all started with Trump again. We're talking about what Biden did. I think that was maybe an even more severe blow to the U.S. dollar's reserve status. All these things have to raise questions in the minds of investors. And I'm sure investors, there's no question, you can see there is a move away from the dollar. It's not dramatic at this point, but there is a move away from the dollar into other currencies. And much of that has been fueled, again, by the sanctions, especially on Russia. And that's going to continue. And I think this kind of conduct is going to simply intensify, that trend. I don't see how it can't. Now, there's a lot of kind of this, to say, inertia. It's just like the U.S. has had this role for so long. And the dollar has had this reputation as being the safe currency for so long that there is just sort of a built-in tendency to go to the dollar, in large institutions and governments around the world. And that just doesn't disappear overnight. But it's being chipped away at. We can, again, there clearly is a trend away from the dollar. It's gradual now, but something that can be gradual for a long time may one day, all of a sudden, when people realize, hey, we may have just hit the tipping point. When that happens, then that gradual trend, becomes panic.
Right.
And again, I'm not pretending it's very, very difficult. I just learned, from experience, it's very difficult to predict these turning points or when these bubbles burst. I think you can spot a bubble. It's just very hard to predict when it'll burst. Now, it could be in the near future. It could be this year, but it could be 10 years. I just don't. I just learned never to actually make that prediction. But it's there. It will happen at some point.
Right. Yeah. Earlier this week, or might have been last week, you were talking about just the kind of the three pillars of the Western hegemony, the U.S. empire. We have the economic pillar, the military pillar, and also the moral pillar. These were the things that allow us to project dominance and stay as a hegemon. But all three of these have been eroding quickly. I mean, we talked about the economic pillar a little bit, just with the current state of affairs with the U.S. economy, the massive amount of debt we have. The dollar status is threatened. Now with these tariffs, we'll see what happens. We've talked about the military side of it as well, that our military dominance has been put into question by the world now, thanks to largely what we've seen in the Ukraine-Russia war, where we have poured almost everything we have, a lot of our best equipment into that war, and it has not performed very well. We see that we're struggling to defeat the Houthis in the Red Sea. And then there's also the moral pillar. Well, first, before I ask my other question, which one of these pillars do you think is the most important one in terms of maintaining Western hegemony, and which one is the furthest degraded?
Yeah, well, that's a hard question. I guess it would be the economic pillar. I think that's a lot for a lot of people and a lot of, again, institutions and governments. They look to the West. They, for example, countries in Europe that are still outside of the EU, they look to the European Union and they say, oh, these guys, they have so much more money than we do. And they don't even really think about some of the other problems. They don't worry themselves over, or they tend to not to focus on, let's say, the military question and the moral question. It's really, the focus is on the economic. I think that's really what drives a lot of the desire to be part of the West on the part of, governments around the world, and to be, to join this alliance, to join this club. In the case of Europe, we're talking about the EU. And if that really collapses, I think that's going to change everything. It's just like, if Europe actually, it's clear that Europe is poorer than Russia. Right now already it just seems like life in places like Moscow or St. Petersburg, it really doesn't seem, like those people are living inferior material lives than people in, capitals of Western Europe. I suppose, I'm sure according to many measures, they still are materially the poor, but you just don't sense that. And again, I get a lot of information from your sister. They're, okay, I'll say they're materially less well off than their counterparts in the West, but that gap is closing. And at some point, it just may close entirely, and maybe Russia, will even move ahead. And when that day comes, a lot of these countries that were just so fixated on becoming part of the EU, they'll stop and they'll probably also look at the other problems and say, like, what's wrong with these people? I think maybe they kind of close their eyes to let's say, the moral problems and the military weakness or whatever. It tended to discount them. But then just like when you see, oh, those people are poorer, actually, than the Russians are, that I think that when we reach that day, then it's like Western hegemony is really over. I think that's really at the core of it. I think that what sustains it, there continues to be a belief, which is founded on something. It's still, these countries still are prosperous countries, by any measure. We're talking again about Western Europe and the U.S. There's no question about it. But as we can see, like, comparing the G7 to BRICS is growing much more rapidly, including Russia, than the G7 countries are. And if that continues over time, then there will be a day where the G7 countries is not the club of the wealthy countries anymore. It's just going to be a club of, sort of the moderately successful countries. And that's, the sheen will be off. It's just not going to be the same thing, and nobody's going to pay any attention to them. And their efforts at insisting on the rules-based international order or whatever, people are just going to laugh at it. I mean, we're already hearing some laughter out on the edges, but I think the laughter will be resounding at that point.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about the moral pillar, because I think that has some more interesting implications on just our civilization moving forward, if we have become truly immoral. And I think what we're seeing happen in Gaza is the biggest moral crisis of our time. And we are complicit in this genocide. The United States fully is. And it's amazing to see the mental gymnastics our government and people that support Israel do to justify what is happening here. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is an enclave of about 2 million people that have been pushed into a tiny sliver of land that are walled in, where 50% of the people are children, and they are being indiscriminately bombed, with 70% of the dead being women and children. I don't know if we've ever seen anything quite like this before. Yeah. And we are constantly defending it. You see these press conferences that U.S. officials give, and they say all the fault is Hamas. They talked about the 15 UN workers that were systematically killed the other day. They bombed an UNRWA refugee camp, and you just see children being babies that are getting slaughtered by U.S. bombs constantly. And somehow we can still justify and say that this is all Hamas's fault, and Israel needs to defend itself, and we are fully complicit in this. And it makes me wonder, because we always in history we hear about the Holocaust, and we read about these past atrocities, and we always think, well, we can never be part of something like this. There's no way that this could happen to us. But here we are, and we are allowing it to happen. We're supporting it. We are making it happen. And I'm just wondering, what will that do to Western civilization? Just how do we live with ourselves moving forward? There has to be a recognition at some point, and then say, oh yeah, most of the people we killed were women and children. Is that okay? Like, how is that ever acceptable? It's staring you right in the face. Everybody knows it. People report it. You see it on BBC News. 70% women and children, and somehow we think that, yeah, it's okay. We all got to go. You see some of our politicians, the things that they tweet. Who's that guy in Florida, Randy Fine, I think, that's saying that, let the streets of Gaza run with blood. And, there's somebody posted a picture of a dead baby, and he said, that's great. We want more of that. This type of stuff, it's insane. Yeah. Like, I guess my question is, what will this do to us? Do you believe that this is the biggest moral crisis of our lifetime? Yeah, no,
I do. It is a huge moral crisis. There's no question about it. And, I would say, our support for Israel, which obviously goes back, long precedes October 7th, has been corrupting. Now, one thing I was listening to, I think it was Professor David Gibbs. I listened to an interview of his maybe just a couple of weeks ago, but he made the point I think was very interesting and very true about the neocons. We've talked about the neocons and their globalist vision. They're former Trotskyites, and they have this idea of, worldwide revolution. So again, now we're not talking about communism, that they've converted from Trotskyism, which is a form of Marxism, to the U.S. way, we'll just say. And so, we need to have a world revolution where, every markets and liberal democracy are instituted in every country around the world. That's the neocon vision. But a part of it, again, a lot of these people, not all of them, but especially the initial group, was almost entirely Jewish. And part of their motivation, a big part of it really was linked to Israel. And one thing is they were admirers of the Israeli way of doing things, meaning that the Israelis didn't seem to show any compunction. Now, this was decades ago. They're actually, things have gotten a lot worse since then. But already, they were sort of like the Israelis didn't hold back. The Israelis took off their gloves. This is something that we need to learn to do too. We have been too timid, let's say, in our dealings with other countries. We have to be forceful like the Israelis. There's this admiration. And you can see that it's happened. It's really changed and corrupted our own government, the hearts and minds of our people. You're just, you gave the example of that Florida legislator. Unfortunately, those kind of comments are all too common. Now, I think I mentioned in some previous program that roughly 20 years ago, George W. Bush, he actually criticized the Israelis for causing the deaths of too many civilians in an attack on a Hamas leader. We're talking about single digits. But to take out this one Hamas leader, several innocent civilians were killed. And he actually criticized them for that. Now, of course, recently with Nasrallah, the assassination of Nasrallah in Beirut, it took out an entire apartment block. We're talking about a huge residential apartment building. And there are hundreds, we're talking about hundreds of civilians that were killed in that. And not only was there no criticism, but that is being celebrated. That's one thing that I was really struck by. Like, for example, in the Witkoff interview, he and Tucker Carlson, just kind of celebrated this assassination. They didn't seem to be concerned that these hundreds of civilians were killed at the same time. And now we can see it actually in the attacks on Yemen. It's like we're almost envious of the Israelis. Again, they take the gloves off. They don't give a damn about all this, humanitarian stuff. They just know to go for the jugular, and we got to do that too. And that's what we've seen. Like, for example, in the attack on the Houthis, there was that those classified or conversations, of course, that were released by Jonathan Goldberg. Vice President Vance and Hegseth and whatever were discussing the attack.
Jeffrey Goldberg.
Yeah, Jeffrey Goldberg. What did I say? Did I say Jonathan?
Jonathan.
Jeffrey. Yeah, it's Jeffrey Goldberg. Absolutely. They were discussing the attack on Yemen, and they mentioned that there was some, Houthi leader who was he had been spotted going into an apartment building, where apparently to visit his girlfriend, and they took out the apartment building, and they all applauded it. Great, again, how many civilians were killed? I mean, that's the thing. It's just that there's just where at least there was, I know you can find many exceptions. Like, of course, the worst ones are in World War II and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Also the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg and in Germany, where many, many civilians were killed. But there was a lot of people actually were concerned about that in the West afterwards, and it was there was a certain amount of self-recrimination. We did it. It was horrible, but there was some discussion about the moral questionableness of this approach, but you just don't see it. It just almost seems like they're happy that they can do this. Yeah, we're like the Israelis, and this is something again that I'm worried about, and maybe is leading us into war with Iran. It's like the recent Israeli successes, and they really are successes, not against Iran. I think that whole thing is phony, that they took out, obliterated their air defense system. But against Syria and against Lebanon, has maybe even kind of inspired a false confidence, that I think I spoke about last time, but also a certain amount of envy. This is something. We can do this too. The Israelis, they're so great. Remember, Netanyahu gave his gift to President Trump was a gold-plated pager,
right?
And that, I think, again, that speaks volumes. And now Trump is saying, okay, yeah, we're gonna do to Iran what Israel is Israel and Turkey, really, most of all, Turkey more than Israel, but what was done to Syria. We weakened them by sanctions. We've got these connections with various insurgent groups within Iran, and we're going to decapitate the leadership, and we're going to, drop these 27,000-pound bunker buster bombs, and we'll just show we're just going to be Israel on steroids. I think, I'm afraid that's the way they're thinking, and I really am very worried about what will happen.
It is scary. I mean, you brought up the fact, World War II, there was the bombing of Dresden and Hamburg, and obviously the fire bombings of like Tokyo and Japan, and then of course the Nagasaki and Hiroshima atom bomb. These were horrible incidents. But we also have to realize that this was done when we were fighting a world war that was going on for 4 years, and tens of millions of people have died already in this conflict, before we dropped the atom bomb. And I don't believe that was a justified thing to do, but this is, you can put it in that context. Yeah. But what we're seeing here is like the Houthis, how many Americans have they killed? The Palestinians, the people in Gaza or in the West Bank, or people in Beirut, Hezbollah, Hamas, how many Americans have they killed? No, but we're just ready to jump straight into this without even, for what? For no real reason, because Netanyahu says we should? That's what's so crazy to me. It's like, this should be making a decision like this. Do we go after Iran with overwhelming force, and we use tactical nuclear bombs straight from the get-go because we know we got to hit them hard, take the Israeli route, and go for the jugular? How can you justify that when there's been no attack on your country or your people from these countries? Like, that's just insane to me that we would be willing to jump to that. But that's where I feel like we're headed. And just like you say, just how flippant we are with being okay with what's happening in Gaza, and just be like, yeah, that's just, we got to get rid of them. These are just bad people. We've othered them. We got to wipe them out. No mercy.
Yeah.
It's nuts. Why? How's this happen? How did we get to this stage? You said you think it's Israel has corrupted us like this, or is it something else that is...
Yeah.
How did we become so immoral?
Well, I think there's no question that the Israeli-U.S. Relationship has been corrupting for the U.S. and corrupting for Israel, for the reasons that we said. It's just that there's unconditional support for the most extreme elements within, or, the not necessarily the most extreme, at least that's not how it started, but for the hardline Zionists within Israel has corrupted Israel. I mean, it's strengthened their position vis-a-vis those that were willing to negotiate and, to avoid a military path. And now, Israel has reached a stage where there really is no voice for peace within Israel. But it's also been corrupting for the U.S. Again, it's, we have tied ourselves to Israel, and with consequences that we can see, now the complicity in a genocide, but then also just an adoption of the Israeli approach, which is increasingly cruel. That just shows no regard for civilian life. And what can I say? I don't want to put the blame all on Israel, because obviously there has to be sort of like a willingness on our part. It's not like we were forced to do that. We could have rejected it. We could have said, oh no, we're not going down that path. But there must, I think, there's always this temptation to throw, all moral qualms aside and just to engage in the raw exercise of power. And Israel has given us that excuse, kind of given us that opportunity, and we've taken it. We didn't have to take it. I can just remember having a conversation with a friend a long time ago, probably a good 30 years, but he said he admitted that he got a lot of vicarious pleasure out of Israel's military exploits. And that really stuck with me. And I think that's true. It's just like there have always been a lot of people in the U.S. that said, damn, I wish we could be like the Israelis. Why do we always, wring our hands and hesitate and, just punch them and punch them hard. Of course, we're talking about a lot more than punching, but you see the picture, and now we can really see that whole. I think like the desire of that friend of mine from decades ago, it's come to fruition, in that we really are engaging in the same kind of behavior, and Israel has actually become much uglier than it used to be, and rather than recoil from that, unfortunately, we are, we seem to be eager to emulate them.
Can we become a moral country again? Because I feel like we were definitely a more moral country in the past. I mean, but it's just amazing how we used to, part of being an American was this belief that we are the land of the free and that we were a moral country and a force for good. But we have slipped so far from that. I think it's hard. It takes a while for people to maybe open their eyes, but a lot of us are having our eyes opened. And just realize, like, what are we doing? That we are becoming one of the most immoral forces in the world right now. I think second to Israel at this point. So it's, I mean, is there any coming back from that? I mean,
yeah, I don't know. Again, I just, again, like this whole, I think there is, but it's going to be a wrenching, maybe it's going to require some kind of revolution or some quasi-revolution. It's not going to be a small adjustment in policy, obviously. It's just that we have been, as John Mearsheimer has put it, joined at the hip with Israel. But it's even become more than that. It just seemed like we're emulating all their worst ways, and you have people. I think it's that same Florida legislator that you're talking about. Is just saying that that basically Israel's interests are somehow indistinguishable from U.S. interests. That's become. They sort of become like Israel is like more American than America is. That's the way that a lot of people are starting to think, and it almost seems to be the way that President Trump thinks. How can you decide? You're going to put America first? Well, it certainly doesn't look like that. But in their minds, it's just like if you put Israel first, you're putting America first, but you can't distinguish between them. Now, this is going to, so, we're talking about sort of like a real fusion of identities or an imagined fusion. Of course, the Israelis, I think, are probably more realistic. They're just saying, wow, these Americans, I don't know why they're going along with this, but this is great. We'll go on this ride here. But the Americans really imagine that, that they're like twins, or they're even more than that. They become one in some sense. I think that's not true, but that's the way people think. So it's going to be, I don't know what it's going to take, but it's going to be, it'll tear apart what the current fabric of society and politics right now. And I think we have to go through that. That's a scary process, but we just have to. I mean, this is sort of like something that's infected our body politic, like a really serious cancer, and it's just not going to. You can't just pop a pill and it'll go away. You can. It's going to require radical surgery, and that's never going to be pretty. I really don't know how it's going to be done, but it does have to happen one way or another.
We need Thomas Massey to become president. It's the only hope. Yeah, it's I kind of think about how other countries handled Germany when it committed the Holocaust. How it reacted afterwards. What will happen to the United States? Will we take that sort of Germany route? Do you think that there will be a moment where we recognize that we've done something horrible? Are we going to be able to whitewash this? How long can we whitewash this? At some point, the truth of what we are being involved in Gaza is going to come out, and there's going to be some type of bill to pay. And I'm just wondering what that is and how the country is going to handle it. Will we apologize for our sins? Are we going to shift the blame somewhere else? Or, there could be a danger of putting all this anger towards the Israelis if people start saying, like, oh, this is because Zionism and the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, have infected our government and have twisted our mind and manipulated us to do these things. And that could be dangerous too. We talk about anti-Semitism being a problem now. Think about what it'll be afterward. It could potentially be afterwards. So there's just, I don't know. What do you think will happen? How will we handle it?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, you put your finger on a number of possibilities. There can be a real backlash against Jewish power. Well, one thing, again, I've been reading a lot of these Haaretz articles, and it just seems like most of these Haaretz liberals, some exceptions, but most of them are concerned about against domestic issues, which are important enough, but they just don't see the elephant in the room, and that's their genocide. That's the thing. If you're worried about Israel's reputation and you're worried about anti-Semitism, that should be your number one concern. I mean, it's just like the longer it goes on, the more likely that there's, this hatred for your people is going to increase over time. I mean, that's just, and a few of them understand that. Again, like people like Gideon Levy, but most of them don't. They just don't want to see it. And so, yeah, again, that's one thing. But another is like you say, you could end up with something similar to what happened in Germany. Of course, Germany was actually militarily conquered. It's hard to see that happening to the U.S. It's there, ensconced between two great oceans. But there could be some kind of revolution. And, after a series of all kind of catastrophic events, and people will just wake up to the fact that our close ties to Israel have been disastrous for us. And so not only would there be, a focus on the Jewish element, but also just on our past, the past government actions. And, looking at like in the case of Germany, I don't think that's been entirely healthy. I mean, the problem is like you can have an alliance that can be right about some things and very wrong about something else. I'm just thinking about the Republicans and Trump in particular right now. Some of his ideas are good. Maybe they're not being executed very well, but I think a lot of his instincts are very healthy and are the reason that he got elected. But Israel could actually bring that all down. And there could be such anger at some point in the future, such anger against Israel and our ties to Israel and the catastrophe that ended in, that you can just, that everything, things that are good about our culture or, about, can be attacked as well as those that are bad. It's just, unfortunately, it's rare that you see a balanced approach. That just doesn't seem to be human nature. Certainly doesn't seem to be the nature of U.S. politics right now. So I don't know. It's just, it could end up very badly. Even a coming to terms may not be so pretty. I think there has to be a coming to terms, but it could, it could have its own ugly underside. Again, it's just like the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. That's the sad thing. Like somebody like J.D. Vance, who clearly is an intelligent person, and I think would be actually make a much better president than Trump would. I'll be honest. Kind of has a similar outlook, but I think he knows how to carry through. Like if he did the tariffs, he would do it more carefully. If he conducted negotiations with Russia, I think he would do it methodically and make some real progress. He wouldn't be so haphazard in his approach. But he too, suffers. There's always this Israeli exception. Like again, he's talking about free speech, and he gave that very powerful speech in Munich. About the loss of, or the decline of democracy in Europe. But then we see the same thing when it comes to Israel. That's always the exception. That's the blind spot. It's the blind spot for Vance as well, and that's what could actually bring them all down. Even when they're right about some things, it's just they have wedded themselves to something that's so terrible that it could undo everything that the potential good that they could cause.
Right. And I'm worried because the United States is so polarized between the left and the right. People aren't able to have any nuance and look at, okay, some of these policies on the left are getting really crazy. Some of these policies on the right are getting crazy. And so if this happens on Trump's term, then we might just see a swing back to, the Biden administration, which was not good either. This was terrible. No. So like it's very worrying for me. And all these things are just convoluting in this one huge maelstrom. We talked about the economic pillar. He says most damaging, and it really looks like we will be hitting a breaking point. You still there?
I lost you.
Okay, I can still hear you. Can you hear me? No worries. Technical difficulties. Anyways, what I was just saying is that we have all these things colliding at once. We have the economic pillar that you've been talking about. We're looking at potential global recession, mass amounts of debt. It's just, we knew at some point it has to break. Maybe you said he can't forecast it. It could be a while, but it's definitely under a lot of strain now.
Yeah.
But then also just what's happening, just the moral crisis we're going through right now, and just the military crisis that we don't have the firepower necessarily to back up all this this rhetoric, that bellicose rhetoric that's coming out of Trump. So I just feel like we're heading towards something cataclysmic. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's just something has to change, and it is changing, right? It's just, I guess that's what we talk about.
Yeah, right. So. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it's very worrying. I just, I really do worry about Trump and what he might do. Let's say there's sort of like two main takes on Trump. One is that, okay, he's actually kind of like the master deal maker. He's always playing 5D chess. Like, he'll say things that are obviously inconsistent, but that was like, that was purposeful. It was just like to throw the opposition off balance. It's part of his strategy. It's like kind of like the ink released by a squid, just to blind his critics while he goes ahead and, he has his plan. And then there are people say, no, it's like Trump is just plain erratic. He says one thing and then he says another because that's who he is. He believes everything when he says it. And I tend to come down on that other side, on the Trump, the erratic. And so I'm worried. It's just like, again, I was very pleased by the initial breakthroughs vis-a-vis Russia, just the fact that we're talking. And that's still something to be happy about, that we are talking, and that for the moment anyway, escalation seems to be off the table. There haven't been the ATACMS strikes into pre-2014 territory and so on and so forth. Okay, that's good. But then we get these threats from again, and then there was recently a threat about maybe intercepting Russian oil tankers in the Baltic Sea. That would just be a direct act of war. And I don't think that's going to happen, but I worry. I just kind of worry about this guy. You have to stop and think. I think sometimes, this is a problem with partisanship, where you want to, you tend to explain away the erratic or, behavior or mistakes on the part of your guy. So, we all had hopes in Trump, especially at the start. And he did do good things, again, I'll say that. But there have been some really crazy things, like this, effort to make Canada the 51st state. And, that's really kind of nutty. Just stop and think, like we sometimes try to say, well, that's just, he's playing some sort of deep game. I don't see how it could be a deep game. Well, first of all, I think it's just over time. People have actually come and asked him, are you for serious? And he keeps on saying, yeah, I'm serious about this. And the Canadians certainly seem to think this is serious. So, he's serious. Well, or even if you think that he isn't, what kind of game is that? It's important for a leader of a major power to actually be somebody like Putin or she, you just have, you're consistent, you think before you talk, because your words have real impact. If you make promises or whatever, then you need to carry through on them. And if you don't, then you've actually created a much more dangerous situation. And Trump just says all kinds of things. And, if you start to get into this habit of thinking, well, yeah, he's just playing these word games or whatever, then that's it just makes it increases general uncertainty in foreign, not just economic relations, but also in diplomatic relations, and that just makes it difficult for any real cooperation to take place, increases the chance of conflict. And I'm just saying again, it's like if let's stop and be honest. Like if Biden started talking about making Canada the 51st state, we'd all be laughing at him and saying, yeah, he's really, his dementia has become that much more serious. Let's be honest. That's what we would say. And I think we have to be honest about Trump. There's some very worrying tendencies here.
Right. But, he has such a strong cult following that I think it propels people don't think rationally about these things that he says. But let's take Greenland, let's bomb Iran, bomb the Houthis. If it was under Biden, we would be upset about it. We started another war in the Middle East. But now that it's Trump, I just wish people weren't so partisan. I just don't understand. People just want to lump you into one of these two categories. And they're horrible categories. Let's don't do that. You know? So right now with the situation with Iran, I was listening to Scott Ritter, and I know you were listening to him. I was trying to listen to him. You listened to him. You said while you're going to bed. I tried to listen to him while I was going to sleep, and it was a terrible idea because, I drift off and Scott, we're all going to die. And I was like, oh my goodness, he's the worst thing to listen to before going to bed. But he had just a very different take than you and I had on what the U.S. could do to Iran. And I'm just wondering, maybe you can expound on that a bit if there's any credence, because the way he's talking about it is that Iran would be wiped out. And, they could do a lot of damage to us, but it's going to be over for Iran. Yeah. That's kind of how he presents it.
Well, I'll say that, I've followed Scott Ritter, from off and on over the years, going all the way back, of course, to the Iraq War, where he was a weapons inspector. Now, he really knows what he's talking about. Again, he was a weapons inspector, and, he had a long history with the U.S. military. He was involved in, strategic planning and so on. So this guy is very well informed, and he's very clearly very, very bright. And I think he's really worth listening to. Now, he's also quite passionate. And that's good too. He really cares. He's really upset, like about what's happening in Gaza, for example. And he really does feel for the Iranians. But I've also noticed, I'm not just making this up right now to rationalize my position, but I've noticed that he does tend to engage in hyperbole. And I think that's just sort of an extension of his passionate nature. So instead of saying if this happens, there's a chance, there's a much increased chance of nuclear war. It's just like, there will be a nuclear war. That's just not true. He doesn't use his words very carefully. He tends to paint the worst scenario possible when he's warning against something. And that has a certain amount of value, because, he is making a point that the chance of nuclear war is so awful. You need to stand there and shout and make people listen to you. And he shouts. And I think he's doing the same thing with Iran. What he's painting a worst case scenario. I think that, in fact, that could happen, what he was saying. He was, essentially saying it could be a repeat of Syria. Iran has been weakened by sanctions, for many years of sanctions. It has been penetrated to some extent by Israeli intelligence. We know that. He mentioned, the case of Hania, the Hamas leader that was assassinated on the day of Pezeshkian's inauguration. And it shows that, obviously they have agents there on the ground in Tehran. And so he thinks that we could see again, and then, a repeat of some combination of Syria and Lebanon, where the U.S. is able to carry out decapitation strikes, and then they have these assets within the country. They bought off certain people, maybe the Iranian government, which has collapsed. There is a fair amount of let's say, dissatisfaction with Iranian leadership among young people. And in the worst case scenario, he could be right. It could happen. But I think, again, he's just giving us the worst case, and that's highly unlikely. It's not impossible. And, it's important for everybody to understand that. But I thought it was interesting that Nima himself pushed back on that. And Nima himself is Iranian and knows Iran very well. And he was saying, for example, that with regard to the sanctions, no, Iran hasn't been hollowed out the way Syria indeed was. Syria was just an economic shell, again, for the reasons that we've discussed earlier. But Iran isn't. And he said, look, Nima, he lives in Brazil, but he's Iranian. He goes back and forth. He says the Iranians live better than the Brazilians. He can say this from direct experience. And one thing, I've mentioned that I've been thinking we're hoping to go to Iran, but now we're, reconsidering because of these threats from the Trump administration. But because we went to go there. We've been watching a lot of videos of just life, everyday life in Tehran. And I tell you, it seems like, a bustling place. And, I know that doesn't prove anything, but it's just not serious. So I think that Scott Ritter exaggerated that possibility. And then with regard to like penetration by Mossad, well, clearly there is some, they have been able to carry out some assassinations, and Hania is the prime example of that. But I think it would be a mistake to think that it's anything on the order of what happened to Hezbollah and to Syria. Apparently, there was the one reason that we saw the Syrian army fold so quickly is that I think a lot of those generals were paid off. Again, you don't have the economic, the extreme economic circumstances that Syria was suffering from. It was much easier to bribe people, and people are really desperate, and so they're more bribable in a place like Syria, was prior to the overthrow of the Assad government. It's just not the same thing. So there's some penetration, but I don't think we have any reason that it's like Hezbollah. And again, it's something, as I pointed out earlier, Hezbollah was always more vulnerable to that because it doesn't have control over the country where it's based. And that country, Lebanon, is deeply penetrated. Everybody knows, openly. Parts of it are just directly controlled by the U.S., including the army. So there are just many more opportunities. It's much easier to penetrate an organization like Hezbollah than it would be to do the same in Iran. So he painted the worst case scenario, which I think we should be aware of, but that's just the worst case. I think it's much more likely that, we're going to, if we go ahead with a major attack like this, they're going to do some serious damage, but the nuclear program will survive, and the result probably will be that they'll go for a bomb. This is the stupid thing, is that actually the only reason that they've even considered this or put them in a position where they could go for it is the fear, of attack by Israel and the U.S. If they didn't always live with that fear, they just wouldn't need a bomb. But then they look at it and they see what happens, like a country like North Korea, again, was constantly threatened. So they went and they got the bomb. And now nobody talks about really attacking them anymore because that the consequences can be catastrophic. So they may do it if we're attacked. I don't think that we can, bring about regime change. I think Scott Ritter's position is, it's well presented and it needs to be considered, but I wasn't convinced by it.
Well, people like Scott Ritter, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a lot of them seem to think that this war with Iran is going to happen. Do you feel that same way? Are you still on that? Like this is where we're headed? We're going to do this?
I am very worried. I really am. It's again, there certainly is a chance. It could be just. Like I've said, Trump is inconsistent, maybe a lot of bluster, and then he'll just change his mind and he'll go on to something else. That's possible. But I'm afraid, we've seen the attack on Yemen. I'm afraid that it really might happen. That's all I can say. I've never been as worried about it as I am right now. There has been talk about, and I know that that previous administrations have considered attacking Iran, but I've never felt as afraid. Maybe my fears are unjustified, but it just seems like it could really be for real this time.
You said the United States would be able to inflict tremendous damage upon Iran, or
potentially,
likely, or potentially, we'll say.
Yeah, it's just like if they really go at them with everything they have. I think, inevitably, no matter how good their air defense is, and we just don't know how good it is, inevitably something's going to get through. And you're dropping, 27,000-pound bombs, you can do a huge amount of damage.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about. So, you think that the way that we would be inflicting this tremendous damage would be with bombs that we would be dropping from aircraft, right? These wouldn't be ICBMs or things like this, right? Is that what you believe it would be?
Yeah, well, that seems to be what's planned. We do have missiles. We have our Tomahawk cruise missiles, for example. And they can do a lot of damage, but they can't do nearly as much damage as, the bombs dropped from a B-2 bomber.
But wouldn't these bombers be shot down? I mean, don't you think that's very likely?
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, we see even the Houthis shooting down these, the Reaper drones, right?
Right, those are supposed to be stealth drones, right? Are they?
Well, I don't know if that claim is made, but I've heard, interestingly about B-2, I was just reading yesterday, that it is, you can fairly describe it as stealth bomber, when it is used against a country that whose air defense is limited to ground installations. In other words, they have ground radars. So they're kind of designed to be invisible or nearly invisible when viewed from the ground by a radar system. But if the country actually has airborne radar, and my understanding is that Iran does. They have some aircraft, I think, from the Russians that can, fly up high to the level of the B-2s and detect their approach. They're not dependent on just ground installations. In that case, they are not stealth. They can be detected, and I think they certainly would have the missiles to bring them down. Again, we've talked about how technology has really favored the, anti-air missiles, vis-a-vis the aircraft themselves. The balance is tipped in favor of the missiles. I think that Iran would end up taking down a significant number of aircraft if we really attempt to, fly into the airspace and bomb them. But inevitably something gets through, and B-2 carrying these 27,000-pound bombs could do a huge amount of damage. Let's be honest, but not, it's not going to end the nation. As like Scott Ritter was saying, I don't think so. It's going to, it's just going to.
And how many of these B-2 stealth bombers would we even use? Like, how many aircraft would potentially be used in such an attack on Iran? I mean, it doesn't seem like we have that massive scale. Nothing like we saw in World War II, where there's thousands of planes coming by.
We do have a very large Air Force. That's something that the U.S. still does have. There's no question that our Air Force is the largest in the world. The Russians have a large one, but it's smaller than the U.S. But, the Russians are not engaged in power projection. In other words, they're not going around to the other side of the world to bomb countries, in the Western Hemisphere or something. And we are. I can't remember the number exactly that were deployed to Diego Garcia. I think you're talking about roughly 10. Again, maybe if you have all 10 of those take off and go for Iran, maybe at least a couple, would get through and could do significant damage. But again, nothing on the scale of overthrowing, leading to the complete collapse of the Iranian government. And another kind of exchange that took place on Nima's show, I think it was both Larry Johnson and Nima kind of pointed this out. Scott Ritter was saying that if the Iranian government is decapitated, that you might just have the people rising up against them. And what both Larry Johnson and Nima said was that no, you could have most likely the opposite effect. I think Larry Johnson pointed to the London Blitz. The idea was that the Nazis would, they were trying to, terrify the British population and to bring about the downfall of the British government. But of course, they had the opposite effect. People were just mad, and they ended up just giving their full support to Churchill and the British government. After this happened, if there was any questions about the war and the need to fight Germany, the Blitz ended it. And I think that could be the same thing with Iran. It's just that as Scott Ritter was pointing out, it's been a long time since the revolution, the Iran-Iraq war. So you have a whole generation that doesn't have any experience of that. But this could be their experience that kind of causes them to rally around the flag all over again. And I think that that's what happened. If if you fail to decapitate the government, you do cause a lot of damage, and you inflict a lot of casualties among civilians. Well, then you've actually created potentially, a much more formidable and united Iran.
Well, let's hope this won't happen, but we will. I mean, it seems like we're going down that road. I hope we can pull back. But it's just so insane. I feel like if we do this, I think I wouldn't be surprised if all of our aircraft get shot down. I think it's possible, right? I mean, aircraft are larger targets, slower moving, and we talk about using Tomahawk cruise missiles. They don't have as big of a payload. Those are also pretty easy to be shot down, these cruise missiles. It's so insane that we're considering this. I just don't, it's hard for me to believe that we will take this path. I mean, there was some encouragement that I saw that Trump was open to indirect talks. Do you think that that's still our pathway off this, our only hope to de-escalate?
I would think that that's the main hope. That's partly what I think Scott Ritter was saying, just telling the Iranians. His position was, look, I know the U.S. is wrong. This is unfair, but to save your nation, just go along with this to some extent. Just make a deal with them, because I don't want to see your government overthrown. I don't want to see hundreds of thousands of Iranians die. It's clear actually the Iranians have been very cautious and been very reluctant to be engaged in the war. They know how, even if the Americans can't defeat them, Iran can really suffer. A lot of Iranians can be killed, and they just don't want to go down that road. The Iranians themselves have said that we're not engaging in direct negotiations, but we could do it through an intermediary. And it potentially could be the Russians. And the Russians might say, look, we know these guys are crazy, but Trump, he wants something to show his domestic audience, to show that he got a deal. Give him something. Maybe it won't mean very much, but if there's something he can show, you just make some minor concession that doesn't hurt you in the long term, that might be enough. But then again, it might not. Just the way that he's talking, it just sounds like, you got to do it. But who knows? Maybe we've seen him do that kind of thing before, where he makes this a lot of this bluster. The other side makes a small concession, and then he walks away with it. But I just wouldn't count on that.
Yeah, it just feels like the Zionists are in control now in the administration.
Yeah.
It seems like Netanyahu's really in the driver's seat more than Trump. Maybe we're wrong, or maybe I'm wrong, but
right. Well, I'll tell you that I just want to say briefly about Netanyahu. Yeah, he seems to be in control of U.S. policy, you could almost say, but his domestic position is pretty precarious. We've talked about these scandals that have been swirling around him, and they're not going away, and they seem to be intensifying. There's some close aides of his that were arrested recently, and I think he's really worried that they could spill the beans about his role in these scandals. And there is a lot of anger within Israel. I mean, again, Israel is a divided society, and he could come down. Part of he's been relying on this coalition of various right-wing parties. But that was shaken recently. Smotrich, one of the ultra-nationalists in his coalition, resigned recently. And I think it was over, it's just like a rivalry between his party and Ben-Gvir's party. We're not talking, this is a split within the right. There was some sort of dispute. I don't understand the nature of it. But it shows that, that's what he was relying on. And that seems to be... less solid than maybe we had previously believed, or he previously believed. And the attacks coming from the various investigative bodies are intensifying, and he might actually have to be forced out of office. Now, does that mean that the Iran attack is off? Not necessarily. Again,
well, with all this pressure building up on Netanyahu domestically, do you think that makes him a more dangerous man, that he just has to expand the war more quickly?
I think so. I mean, I think it's clear that he sees that may be his only way to keep out of jail and to save his career. This is something he's always wanted to do, this attack in Iran. But I think that it's just like it's coming to the point where he may feel his back is against the wall, and it has to be done soon. That's part of the real danger right now. We have a desperate man in office in Israel, and then we have just a very unstable man in office in the U.S. And that combination is not good. And all of them are surrounded by, Iran hawks.
It's so disappointing, Trump campaigning on an America First platform, no more wars. And it seems like it's an Israeli First platform where Netanyahu's in charge. It's just... It's such a sad state of affairs, and it's just amazing to me that we let our country become like this.
Yeah.
That this is the country, the greatest country in the world, America, and this is what it's become.
Yeah. Well, that's really part of the problem, is that notion of American exceptionalism has brought us to where we are. We're not just an ordinary country among other countries, but we're exceptional. And that way, we're kind of similar to the Israelis. Like, they don't really have to negotiate with the countries around them because they're exceptional. And it's up to them to decide, where to draw their boundaries. No other country does that. It just seems, no other, and the U.S. just seems to think it has the right to punish any country in the world. That's the way we talk, on both the left and right in this country, both the Democrats and the Republicans. It's malign behavior on the part of the Russians or the Chinese, it must be punished. And so, like, who are you? Are you the... Are you running a boarding school or something? It's just like, you don't just get to decide who to punish. You're a nation among nations, and you need to negotiate.
Well, I pray that one day we can find our morality again, our moral center, learn some humility, and be able to live in this world without trying to punish people constantly, without having so much death and suffering.
Right.
Maybe one day, but I feel like it's going to get a lot rockier before that happens. So
yeah, I'm afraid so. I'm afraid you're right.
Okay, well, let's end it there, Dad.
Sure.
Okay, have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.